Chapter 1. The Label They Put on Me. They said I was mentally unstable, so my own family quietly took control of my money, my decisions, my life. No yelling, no court order, just one meeting and a signature I never agreed to. I stayed silent while they watched my bank account, rewrote my past, and waited for me to fall apart. I am Eleanor, and if you have ever been told your emotions made you unfit to decide your own life, this story is for you. I remember the room before I remembered the words. The living room in my mother's house in suburban Connecticut looked exactly the same as it always had. Neutral colors, carefully chosen furniture, everything arranged to look calm and reasonable. That was the point. Calm and reasonable was the tone they wanted before they ever opened their mouths. I was 41 years old and sitting on the same couch where I used to do homework as a teenager. My mother, Margaret, sat across from me with a neat stack of papers already aligned at the edge of the coffee table. My brother, Victor, stood near the window, arms crossed, watching me like I was a problem he had already solved. The family lawyer was there too, seated comfortably as if this were a routine meeting. No one had told me there would be a lawyer. Victor did most of the talking at first. He always did. He had that way of speaking for people, especially for me, as if I might say the wrong thing if left unsupervised. He said this was just a conversation. He said everyone was worried. He said we all wanted the same thing: stability, safety, peace of mind. My mother nodded along, eyes damp but controlled. She reached for my hand once and squeezed it in that careful way that looks loving from the outside. I remember thinking that it felt rehearsed. Then Dr. Alan Pierce walked in. I did not know he was coming. I had not scheduled an appointment. I had not consented to an evaluation. He smiled politely and introduced himself as if we were meeting for the first time, though I had seen him before at family events. He was our doctor, Victor said. He was here to help explain things. Explain what? I asked. Victor answered before anyone else could. He said that after everything I had been through, the year I took off from work in 2019, the stress, the isolation, it might help to have a professional perspective. He spoke slowly, kindly, as if explaining something to a child. Dr. Pierce talked about patterns. He talked about emotional instability. He talked about how grief and burnout can blur judgment. He said there were signs that I might not always be making decisions in my own best interest. He said this with a gentle smile, like a concerned neighbor. I remember waiting for someone to ask me how I felt. No one did. Instead, my mother slid one of the papers toward the center of the table. She said it was just a formality, something to make sure bills were paid and nothing slipped through the cracks while I got back on my feet. She said it was temporary. She said it was for my protection. That was the first time I heard the phrase power of attorney spoken out loud in that room. I tried to laugh it off. I said I was fine. I said I had taken time off work because I chose to, not because I had lost control of myself. I said plenty of people step back from their careers without being declared unstable. Victor sighed, the way people do when they want you to feel unreasonable. He said no one was declaring anything. He said I was overreacting. He said this was exactly the kind of emotional response they were worried about. That was when I started to understand what was happening. They pulled out emails I had written months earlier, taken out of context, lines where I admitted being tired, frustrated, overwhelmed. They read them aloud like evidence. Dr. Pierce nodded thoughtfully and said those expressions aligned with mood dysregulation. My private journal, something I had once left at my mother's house, was referenced too. Thoughts written in moments of fear were treated like permanent diagnoses. Every reaction I had was folded neatly into their narrative. If I protested, it proved their point. If I cried, it confirmed their concern. If I went quiet, it showed withdrawal. I realized then that the room was not a place for discussion, it was a stage, and my role had already been assigned. The mini-climax came quietly. No shouting, no raised voices, just Victor checking his phone and saying that the accounts had already been secured, just to be safe. He said it casually, like mentioning the weather. He said the paperwork had been filed earlier that week. I asked what he meant by secured. The lawyer finally spoke. He said that due to concerns about my capacity, the power of attorney had been activated. Effective immediately, Victor would be managing my financial affairs, until further notice. I felt something drop in my chest, a cold, hollow feeling. My debit cards would not work. My access to company shares was suspended. Decisions that had been mine for decades were no longer mine at all. I looked at my mother. She would not meet my eyes. That was when I noticed the way Victor and Dr. Pierce spoke to each other. First names, familiar shorthand, a shared glance when I questioned a detail. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I could not unsee it. This was not a neutral evaluation. This was a coordinated effort. I felt embarrassed in a way that went deeper than anger, ashamed even though I had done nothing wrong. There's a special kind of humiliation that comes from being discussed as if you're not fully present, as if your version of reality no longer counts. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table. Instead, I sat there, heart racing, mind clear, realizing that any strong reaction would only strengthen their case. So, I stopped talking. When the meeting ended, Victor said they were doing this because they loved me. My mother said we'd all get through this together. Dr. Pierce said we could schedule follow-ups. I stood up, thanked them for their concern, and walked out. I drove away from the house I grew up in feeling smaller than I had ever felt, not because I believed them, but because I understood how easily they could make others believe them, how quickly a competent adult woman could be reframed as unstable when money and control were involved. That night, alone in my apartment, I replayed every moment, the careful language, the timing, the paperwork already filed. This had not been about my well-being. This had been about convenience. I did not sleep much. I kept thinking about how dangerous it would be to fight this head-on, how loudly protesting would only feed their story. They needed me reactive, emotional, unpredictable. I decided then that I would give them none of that. If they needed me to look weak in order to feel powerful, I would let them believe it. I would be quiet, I would observe, I would wait. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's cover. If you have ever been told your emotions made you unfit to decide your own life, stay with me, because this is the part where I stopped defending myself and started paying attention.
Chapter 2. Silence was my cover. The days after that meeting fell into a strange, quiet pattern. I moved through them slowly, carefully, as if any sudden motion might trigger another intervention. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom I had chosen years earlier for its convenience, not for comfort. Now it felt like a holding space, safe enough to stay invisible, exposed enough to remind me I was being watched. I learned quickly what limited meant. My debit card declined on the third day when I tried to buy groceries. I stood there at the register, heat rising in my face, while the cashier asked if I wanted to try another form of payment. I smiled and said I had forgotten my wallet. That was the first lie I told to protect myself. Later that night, Victor sent a short message. He said there had been a system adjustment. He said it was temporary. He said I should let him know if I needed anything. The words were polite. The meaning was clear. Every dollar now passed through him. That was when the doubt started creeping in. Not doubt about him, doubt about me.
I would wake up some mornings with my chest tight, my thoughts racing, and I would ask myself if this was what they meant, if this constant second-guessing was proof that something was wrong with me. I replayed conversations in my head and wondered if I had sounded irrational. I read my old emails again and saw the desperation in them that I had once dismissed as exhaustion. Gaslighting does not arrive all at once. It settles in quietly and starts rearranging the furniture of your mind. I caught myself measuring my reactions, editing my feelings before I allowed myself to feel them, asking permission from an invisible panel before deciding whether I was allowed to be upset. I stopped telling people what had happened, not because I wanted to protect my family, but because I was no longer sure how to explain it without sounding unstable. The story itself had been poisoned. I kept my days simple. I cooked at home, I walked instead of driving, I avoided spending money unless I absolutely had to. Every purchase felt like a request for approval. Even silence felt safer than independence. My Aunt Helen was the exception. She called one evening and asked how I was doing, not in the careful way my mother had, not with the rehearsed concern, just a straightforward question. How are you holding up? I hesitated before answering. Then I told her everything. The meeting, the paperwork, the diagnosis I had never agreed to. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that stopped me cold. I never believed them. I asked what she meant. She told me she had seen versions of this before, not the diagnosis, but the behavior. She said Victor had always been comfortable taking over decisions that were not his to make. She said my mother had always mistaken control for care. Then she mentioned an email. Back in 2016, when Whitmore Holdings was expanding aggressively, I had sent a detailed message to the executive team. I had flagged risk exposure, accounting shortcuts, a potential compliance issue that could become serious if ignored. At the time, Victor had brushed it off, said I was being overly cautious. Helen told me she had kept a copy. She said she did not know why she had saved it at the time, maybe instinct, maybe habit, but she had it, time-stamped and intact. Proof that I had once been the voice of reason they were now calling unstable. I felt something shift when she said that. Not relief exactly, more like orientation, like realizing I was not lost, just turned around. After that call, I started paying closer attention to the mechanics of what had happened to me. Not the emotions, but the structure. Who had authority? What processes had been bypassed? What assumptions everyone else seemed to accept without question? I began reading again, late at night, on my laptop, careful not to leave traces. I looked up civil law, power of attorney statutes, patient rights, the ethics of psychological evaluation. I learned about conflicts of interest and how easily they could be hidden behind professional language. I did not feel brave while doing this. I felt cautious, like someone walking across thin ice, testing each step before putting weight on it. Victor tested me too. A week after my call with Helen, Victor sent another email, this one longer. He said he had noticed some irregular spending, nothing serious, he assured me, just something to be mindful of. He reminded me that the arrangement was meant to help me focus on recovery, not create additional stress. He ended by saying continued cooperation would make everything smoother for everyone. The message was friendly, the implication was not. I realized then that my silence had created a new problem for him. He could not tell if I was planning something, and uncertainty made people like Victor uncomfortable. So I leaned into it. When I visited my mother, I spoke less. I answered questions vaguely. I let my thoughts drift mid-sentence. I forgot small details on purpose. When Victor corrected me, I nodded and thanked him. I watched the relief flicker across his face as he concluded I was slipping, not strategizing. Dr. Pierce noticed it too. During a follow-up call, he asked how I had been feeling. I told him some days were foggier than others. I said it casually, without drama. He sounded satisfied. That performance cost me more than I expected. Pretending to be unstable, even strategically, leaves residue. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I was becoming the version of myself they needed me to be, if acting confused would eventually blur into being confused. The mini-climax came quietly, the way most truths do. While reviewing one of the documents I had been sent, I noticed a paragraph that felt familiar, too familiar. The phrasing was odd, generic, clinical. I searched a fragment of it online and found a match. Another patient record, different name, different case, same language. Dr. Pierce had copied it. It wasn't the smoking gun yet, but it was a crack, and cracks are where light gets in. I printed the page and filed it away, carefully, methodically. I did not react. I did not confront anyone. I had learned by now that reaction was what they expected. Documentation was what they feared. By the end of that month, I knew 3 things for certain. I was not imagining what had happened, I was not powerless, and I could not afford to move too quickly. So one night, after rereading the email Helen had saved and double-checking the copied diagnosis language, I opened a new message. I addressed it to Rachel Kim, a civil attorney in New York whose name I had come across in a case study about family control disputes. I kept the message short, polite, neutral. I asked about independent psychological evaluations and whether a patient could request one without family involvement. I read it twice, then I sent it. I closed my laptop and sat there in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. Nothing had changed yet. No alarms went off, no doors opened. But for the first time since that meeting in Connecticut, I felt like I had taken a step that belonged to me. Chapter 3. When Facts Started Talking. The reply from Rachel Kim did not arrive with reassurance. It arrived with clarity, and that felt heavier. She wrote that an independent psychological evaluation was possible. She also wrote that it would not be simple, cheap, or protected. She warned me that once I initiated it, the result would exist whether it helped me or hurt me. If it came back unfavorable, my family could use it to tighten their grip. If it came back clean, they could still fight it. Either way, the process itself would alert them that I was no longer passive. I read the message several times before responding. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My mind was not. I scheduled the evaluation in New York for early 2022. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell Victor. I told Helen, and she asked if I was sure. I was not sure. I was just ready. The first session lasted nearly 4 hours. No clipboard diagnoses, no leading questions. The evaluator asked about my childhood, my work, my relationships. She asked how decisions were made in my family. She asked who benefited when I doubted myself. At one point, she said, "You seem very aware of how you're being perceived. That is not the same thing as being unstable." I almost cried then, not because I felt validated, but because someone had finally separated observation from accusation. Each session took something out of me. I left exhausted, my head buzzing, my body heavy. I kept thinking about the cost. The money was substantial, and every payment passed through Victor before it reached the provider. Each charge was a risk. Each appointment was a breadcrumb. I knew what would happen when he noticed. It started with a call. He sounded warmer than he had in months. "I have been thinking about us," he said, "about how all of this got so complicated." I stayed quiet. "I think we rushed things," he continued. "We were just trying to help. Maybe we can reset." Reset meant paperwork. He offered to restore limited access to my accounts. He offered to loosen oversight. All he needed was confirmation that the original arrangement had been appropriate, a signature acknowledging that the power of attorney had been necessary at the time. It would make everything cleaner, he said, for everyone. I told him I would think about it. Rachel was less diplomatic when I relayed the conversation. They want you to validate the narrative retroactively, she said. Do not sign anything. She explained what civil fraud could look like in cases like mine, how medical opinions tied to personal relationships could invalidate entire chains of authority, how documentation mattered more than emotion. She introduced me to Daniel Reyes, an investigative journalist who specialized in public records. Daniel was methodical. He pulled licensing histories, prior complaints, continuing education records. He found that Dr. Pierce had collaborated with Whitmore Holdings on wellness initiatives years earlier. Not illegal, not disclosed either. The mini-climax came in an email from the evaluator. She wrote that the assessment was complete. She attached a summary and asked if I wanted to review it together. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the file. It stated clearly that I was cognitively intact, that my emotional responses were proportionate to prolonged stress, that there was evidence consistent with sustained psychological manipulation by close family members, that prior diagnoses lacked sufficient clinical basis. I did not feel relief. I felt cold, because the conclusion didn't just clear me, it exposed them. Rachel read it and went quiet. Then she said there was something else I needed to see. She had reviewed my father's estate documents. A trust amendment from 2014 included a clause I had never been told about. If a beneficiary or proxy engaged in deception involving medical or legal incapacity to gain control, their inheritance could be suspended pending investigation. My father had known this was possible. He had planned for it. I sat there imagining how long this had been in motion, how many conversations had happened without me, how many decisions had been justified by calling me unstable instead of inconvenient. Victor called again that week. His tone had shifted. I just want to put this behind us. Dragging lawyers into it will only make things worse. I almost laughed. Instead, I thanked him for his concern and told him I was focusing on my health. When the call ended, I saved the evaluation report to multiple locations. I printed copies. I did nothing else. That was the hardest part, knowing I had proof and choosing not to use it yet. Because facts don't protect you just by existing. They protect you when they are timed correctly. At the end of that month, I locked the documents away and returned to silence. I let Victor believe his offer had worked. I let my mother believe I was retreating again. The truth had started talking. I just wasn't ready to let them hear it yet. If you've ever learned something that could change everything, but realized that saying it too soon would only cost you more, you already understand why I waited.
Chapter 4. The story turned around. By the time I asked for the meeting, it was already 2024. Almost 4 years had passed since the afternoon my life had been quietly signed over without my consent. In those years, nothing about me had changed the way they expected. I had not collapsed. I had not begged. I had not disappeared. I had simply waited. The request itself was simple. I emailed Victor and said I wanted to talk about closing the loop on everything. I said I wanted clarity. I asked that the meeting take place at Whitmore Holdings with an independent attorney present. I did not explain why. I did not argue. I did not threaten. He agreed within an hour. That should have been my first sign that he thought he was still in control. The conference room at Whitmore Holdings was all glass and polished wood. It smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Victor sat at the head of the table, relaxed, confident. My mother, Margaret, sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. Dr. Alan Pierce arrived last, nodding politely, looking almost bored. Rachel Kim sat to my left. She did not smile. She did not need to. I began by thanking everyone for coming. My voice sounded steady. That surprised me. I told them I wanted to walk through how we had gotten here, not emotionally, logistically.
I started with the power of attorney, the date it had been activated, the lack of my consent, the circumstances under which it had been justified. Victor leaned back in his chair. "We did what we thought was necessary," he said. "You were not yourself." I nodded. Then I slid the first document across the table, a copy of the Independent Evaluation Summary. Rachel spoke before I did. "This report concludes that Eleanor Whitmore is cognitively intact and fully capable of managing her affairs." Victor barely glanced at it. "Anyone can find a doctor to say what they want," he said. That was when I placed the email from 2016 on the table, the one Helen had kept. I explained what it was, a warning about compliance risks, a recommendation that had been ignored. "I was not unstable," I said quietly. "I was inconvenient." My mother looked at the paper as if it might bite her. Dr. Pierce cleared his throat. "I would like to clarify something," he said. "My assessment was based on the information available to me at the time." Rachel turned to him. "That information included a personal relationship with Mr. Whitmore," she said. The room shifted. Victor laughed once, too quickly. "That is ridiculous." Rachel slid another document forward, records Daniel Reyes had pulled, evidence of collaboration, undisclosed overlap. Dr. Pierce hesitated just for a second. "I have known Victor socially," he said. "That did not affect my professional judgment." Rachel did not raise her voice. "It should have been disclosed." Silence stretched across the table. Then Victor leaned forward. "This is what this is about," he said, pointing at me. "Revenge. You want to embarrass us. You want to rewrite history." I met his eyes. "No," I said. "I want accuracy." That was the mini-climax, the moment when the story stopped belonging to him. Dr. Pierce spoke again, softer this time. "In hindsight, there may have been a conflict that should have been addressed." The independent attorney took notes. Victor turned red. "You cannot seriously be doing this," he said. "You know what will happen if this gets out." There it was, the threat dressed as concern. "We will destroy your credibility," he continued. "No one will trust you. You think one report fixes everything." Rachel spoke calmly. "There is a clause in Thomas Whitmore's estate documents that addresses this situation directly." She placed the trust amendment on the table. "If a proxy or beneficiary gains control through deception involving medical or legal incapacity, their authority is suspended pending investigation." Victor stared at the page. My mother began to cry. "This is a misunderstanding. We were just trying to help her." The attorney closed his notebook. "At this point," he said, "we will need to initiate a review." The twist landed quietly. No dramatic announcement, just a procedural shift that changed everything. Victor's access was frozen. An investigation was opened. Whitmore Holdings would be audited. The power he had wielded for years evaporated in real time. I did not feel triumph. I felt tired. As the meeting ended, Victor stood abruptly. "You think you have won," he said. "This is not over." I gathered my papers. "I know," I said. "That is why I waited." I walked out of the room while they stayed behind, arguing in lowered voices, scrambling to regain ground that no longer existed. In the elevator, I stared at my reflection in the mirrored wall. I looked exactly the same as I had 4 years earlier, no different, no stronger, just no longer silent. The doors opened onto the lobby. I stepped outside into the afternoon light and kept walking, leaving the building and the story they had told about me behind. Chapter 5. What I Took Back. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly through emails, board notices, and conversations that no longer included me but could no longer ignore me either. Victor was removed as CFO within weeks. The language was polite and procedural. Temporary leave pending review. Everyone knew what it meant. His access was suspended. His authority evaporated in stages, each one quieter than the last. The man who once spoke for me could no longer speak for himself without a lawyer present. My mother, Margaret, was questioned next. Not arrested, not charged, just asked to explain her role. That was almost worse. She had always believed that good intentions were a shield. Sitting across from investigators forced her to realize that intent does not erase impact. The word complicity entered the conversation. I never heard her use my name during that process. Whitmore Holdings announced a restructuring. Consultants were brought in. Compliance audits expanded. The company did not collapse, it adjusted. That was the irony. All that control, all that manipulation, and the system itself kept moving without them. Rachel called me one morning and told me the board wanted to meet. They framed it as a solution, stability, continuity, a way to restore confidence. They said the cleanest path forward would be for me to step in, full control, executive authority, access to everything that had once been used to corner me. For a moment, I considered it, not because I wanted the power, but because I wanted the symmetry. The idea of sitting in Victor's chair felt like balance, like justice with a neat ending. That feeling passed quickly. What lingered instead was a memory. I remembered sitting on that couch in Connecticut, being spoken about instead of spoken to. I remembered how easily my competence had been erased, how quickly my voice had been replaced. The worst thing they took from me was not money, it was credibility. It was the assumption that I knew my own mind. No title could give that back. I told the board I would accept what was legally mine, no more, no less. Rachel did not look surprised. I kept my shares, I regained control of my finances, I declined the rest. The room was quiet after that. People do not always know what to do with someone who refuses to play the expected role. I walked out of that meeting lighter than I had in years. In the weeks that followed, I began to put things back together on my own terms. Not publicly, not performatively, quietly. I returned to work as a consultant. I rebuilt routines that did not require permission. I slept better. One afternoon, Helen called and asked what I planned to do with the rest. The rest turned out to be the most important part. I had learned too much to pretend this was rare. I had seen how easily concern could be weaponized, how often women are called unstable when they threaten convenience, how many people are trapped by family dynamics that look loving from the outside and feel suffocating from within. So I created something small, a legal assistance fund. Modest at first, enough to help people access independent evaluations, enough to cover initial consultations, enough to make silence optional. I did not attach my name to it publicly. That was not the point. The point was access. The point was timing. The point was making sure that someone else could speak before they were cornered into waiting as long as I had. I never confronted Victor again. There was nothing left to say. He had lost his position, his narrative, his certainty. Watching him scramble would not have added anything to my life. My mother wrote once, a careful letter, apologies that never quite landed. I read it, folded it, and put it away. Closure does not always look like reconciliation. The last thing I took back was the story. For years, I had lived inside a version of myself that had been written by other people. Sensitive, unstable, in need of supervision. It had followed me into rooms I did not even enter anymore. It had shaped how others saw me before I spoke. That story ended the moment I stopped trying to disprove it and started documenting reality instead. I did not win against my family. That framing never felt right. Winning implies competition. This was not a game. I reclaimed something simpler, the right to be an adult woman whose emotions did not disqualify her from autonomy, the right to be complex without being discredited, the right to choose when to speak and when to wait. If you are listening to this and recognize pieces of your own life in it, remember this: silence is not weakness when it is intentional. Facts matter, timing matters, and the law, slow and imperfect as it is, can still be a tool if you learn how to use it. If this story resonated with you, stay here. There are more truths like this, quiet ones that do not look dramatic until you understand what they cost. And if you have ever been told that trusting your own mind was dangerous, I hope you know now that it's not. It might be the thing that saves you.